But they, as a human creation, are subject to revision and improvement, development. After all, what is wrong with human rights being declaratory, aspirational, persuasive, provisional, improvable, adaptable? Nothing. It allows for their improvements. They're not set in stone, a fate which is not always benign, as you can see if you look at the results of the US Constitution in various ways, or the rigid French concept of laïcité. Our assertion of human rights sets standards for behaviour for government. They have effect through setting an international agenda, through raising the ambitions of governments, through informing the demands of people, and if necessary, by arraigning governments before the bar of world opinion or even before international courts. So mere talk does have its value, but the treaties that we have made internationally between countries, in which countries commit themselves to upholding and extending these human rights, these go even beyond talk. Making them subject to, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, may make them subject to courtroom argument, which sometimes seems somewhat pernickety and dry, maybe perhaps demeans them. But it does mean that we as individuals can ultimately hold our own governments to account. And in some cases, we as humanists can either use the courts or threaten to use them so as to enforce our own rights. If you consider, for example, Article 9 of the European Convention, the guarantee of freedom of religion or belief, that, as I've said at the beginning, includes the freedom to reject belief, to reject religion, or to hold non-religious beliefs. In 1994, in a case at Strasbourg, it was ruled that the Article 9 was not just valuable for the religious, but was, quote, a precious asset for atheists, skeptics, and the unconcerned. And this is something that we can use in public argument, in lobbying government, and in the courts filing them to ensure we don't suffer discrimination. So human rights are consonant with humanism, so much so that we may feel tempted sometimes to claim them as our own, our Enlightenment-invented contribution to human welfare. But that would actually be going too far. Human rights are equally compatible with a religious outlook, and this is an important driver to our beliefs in human rights. They may seem, as it were, a godsend to us as humanists in an erstwhile hostile religious world, but they belong equally to the religious. The religious would refer them to some transcendental basis, or would talk, as they do, of morality, of values immanent in the universe, or of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of mankind. We can't refute their religious rationale any more than they can refute our naturalistic account. But we can do agree that human rights should be observed and beyond. Of course, sometimes Christians, Muslims and others may assert their rights in ways that we feel oppressive. And sometimes, but not always, we may be right in feeling it to be oppressive. We may have to work hard to persuade public opinion and ultimately the courts that the churches or mosques or whoever have gone too far to overstep the mark in particular cases. And this is where we find the cases about crucifixes on classroom walls, about conscientious objection to prescribing contraceptives or providing IVF, about exemptions from equality laws, not just for churches, but for all manner of religious organisations, about demands for public subsidies, demands for public prayers, official prayers, for legal bans on divorce or abortion or embryonic stem cell research. The religious right, starting in America, has been very clever, one might observe, in casting its demands for privilege, for exemption from equality and non-discrimination laws and the like, as denials of religious liberty. To do so, they ignore and induce the public and the press to ignore the intrusions that they are making on the lives and liberties of everyone else. Their infringements on the rights of the non-religious, of gays, of women, of children, as they disingenuously assert their own demands under the guise of corrections and infringements of their rights. And need to watch carefully such bodies as the European Centre for Law and Justice, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Beckett Fund, the Catholic Family and Human Rights Institute, and the European Dignity Watch, all very powerful and persuasive operators, having strong influence on politics at an international level and a national level sometimes, and on the courts. They are working to impose religious values on society, and often working to a very high legal standard that deserves respect. Our opposition to them needs to be equally expert. But sometimes the boot is on the other foot. Is it not a breach of human rights to ban the wearing of the burqa in public or the veil at school, or to seek to ban internal religious tribunals such as Sharia courts or Jewish Beth Din, so long as they are resorted to voluntarily by adherents of that religion? Even at the home of human rights, in Europe, the NGO's conference at the Council of Europe a week ago, I had to defend religious rights against strong voices calling for government interference and regulation of their internal affairs, from calls, sometimes even from ultra-liberal Catholics, for legislation against the rule of celibacy in the Roman Catholic Church. What is source for the goose is source for the gander. We may think that enforcement of celibacy on priests is undesirable, even cruel or stupid, but it's an internal rule of a sort of private club, and we would not want government to be imposing rules on our private clubs or voluntary organisations. It's not always clear what is the right balance to be struck in these cases where freedom of religion or belief clashes with demands for equality and non-discrimination or freedom of expression. Article 9 of the Convention offers us some guidance. These rights are subject to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of public safety, protection of public order, health or morals, or protection, importantly, of the rights and freedoms of others. Sometimes the meaning of these words has to be decided by taking cases to the courts, where the results add to a growing body of case law. But we should, if possible, seek to establish a public consensus before such cases go to court, partly because court can be unpredictable, and partly because it is a long, slow, and expensive process to go to court. But this demands a lot of very careful thought, for example, about the limits to conscientious objection, on which I've spoken and written elsewhere. It's an area where there is ample scope and opportunity for humanists to get involved, attending and speaking at the very many legal and academic, local and international conferences that are happening just now on such issues, writing about those issues on blogs and elsewhere, lobbying politicians, not least members from each country of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, who produce influential resolutions on such questions, but are subject to very powerful lobbying by our opponents. But that's all material for quite different talk. I think I've gone on long enough, so we've got some time for questions. Thank you.
So I don't open up the floor to questions, and I would ask perhaps for people to keep their questions to two per person, rather so that everyone has an opportunity to ask a question if everyone has one. So does anyone have any pressing questions, concerns, or anything they would like to ask?
Can I ask you a slightly sideways question?
Yes, I'm happy to answer questions about anything you like.
I heard a London-based atheist last week give a kind of an overview of activities in the UK, probably a London-based one, and he mentioned everybody, secular society, but not the Rationalist Association. And when I asked him, he was slightly derogatory, and then he said, "Oh, that crowd are trying to take over everything." And I saw your name.
So who was trying to take over?
That the Rationalist Association were trying to. He seemed. I'd be interested to hear you. I'm kind of confused about their relationship with say.
I think that's very far from the truth.
Well, that would be my understanding as well.
The Rationalist Association, the old Rationalist Press Association, is concerned exclusively now with producing the magazines and Humanists and the associated website. And they are a very long way from having any imperial ambitions at all.
And is that just the relationship with the New Humanists? They're the producers of the magazine?
They are the publishers of the magazine, and that is pretty well. Look, they wouldn't say it's their own function. I mean, they run in London a wonderful institution called 9 Lessons and Carols for Godless People, which happens every Christmas and over about 8 or 9 nights in theatres, which present a mixture of stand-up comics and stand-up scientists, and very popular indeed. And they do occasional other meetings, but essentially they run New Humanist magazine.
So there'll be 9 rather than taking over.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
You were mentioning before that there is an argument in regard to human rights in regard to culture. Again, I mean, this is just a question in regard to how do you actually respond to people from other hemispheres that have a radically different viewpoint on what they consider human rights, and how would you argue objectively in regard to how our human rights as humanists are more rational in that regard? I mean, anything could be considered a human right depending on the point of view of the person arguing it, if their worldview includes supernatural aspects or divine mandates. It becomes very hard to find a middle ground in that regard, because their entire mode of authority is external to themselves, and therefore they don't recognise humans having a right to decide human rights because they see it as too subjective. So I was just trying to know what kind of attitude would you have in regard to responding to that?
Yes, certainly. Certainly, if you try to have an argument about human rights with a devout Muslim, an Islamist style Muslim, then you won't get very far. Muslims say they attribute. They say the whole of life should be determined by their religion, by their religious duties, and they have very often they have very detailed rules about exactly how you should behave in certain depth and so on. But what I was saying in my talk was that what is demonstrated is that when you talk to individuals who are not caught up in that sort of culture, who are the ordinary people in the street, as it's in Tahrir Square in Cairo or Taksim Square in Istanbul, they have exactly the same aspirations as anyone in a Western democracy, individual freedom. And they have those even though they are followers of, in that case, Muslim religion, just as the majority of Christians will endorse only the idea of human rights and will not follow some of the extreme versions of their religion that are imposed from above by the religious hierarchies. So what I'm saying is that if you get to the ordinary people, rather than those whose attitudes are dictated by a very authoritarian religion, then you find that the aspirations, the ideas of human rights are effectively the same as we have here. And especially if you talk to women from North Africa who emerged into prominence through the Arab Spring, and the humanists have had through one or two of the national organisations in Europe, particularly Morocco, have had quite close contacts with some of these people. They are desperate to assert their rights in exactly the same terms as the Universal Declaration, which was adopted by all nations. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
I don't
It's probably anecdotal, but I find it a bit worrying sometimes. It seems to me that the Conservative powers seem to have a bigger money pot than us Liberals.
True, yes.
I guess my question is, could we possibly consider equaling the balance, or are we going wrong? This sort of thing.
Can you offer any solutions?
It's that question I'm throwing at you.
Absolutely right. I mean, these organisations that I mentioned at the end, the Beckett Fund, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the European and the American Centers for Law and Justice, these are extraordinary. They seem to have money coming out their ears. And this, of course, is the pattern in America, where the American right has money. Money is the least difficulty they have. The Koch brothers funding the Tea Party movement is all part of the same phenomenon. And you have there what is emerging in Europe as well, an extraordinary alliance between the evangelicals and the Catholics. The Catholics are providing intellectual rigor. When I talked about the arguments that were being put forward, legal arguments being put forward from, say, the Beckett Fund, that is a predominantly Catholic organisation, but very right-wing authoritarian Catholics. They are immensely clever. They have very, very well qualified law professors and practitioners on their books, as they were doing their work for them, and lots of money. But the bullets that they shape are often fired by the evangelicals, who are less intellectual, don't have that sort of talent, but do have the numbers and do have the clout politically, and they exclusively work together. And this is emerging in Europe as well, because the European Centre for Law and Justice, if you go to their website, it looks at first sight very much like the website of the European Court of Human Rights. It's clearly modelled, colours and layout as well on that. That is funded from America by the evangelist Pat Robertson. And yet it works very closely with the Vatican. And the motivations of the Americans, the American right, the American British right, in getting involved in Europe is patently clear. It's not so much they're worried about what happens in Europe. They're worried that what happens in Europe is a major influence on their cause. The international setup is now, although theoretically, of course, the Supreme Court in America merely interprets their constitution, and the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights merely interprets the European Convention. In actual fact, as a matter of good sense and good practice, courts take into account judgments on similar matters that have been reached elsewhere in the world. For our Commonwealth, for example, judgments are quoted across national boundaries, and Australian or Canadian judgments, for example, will be quoted in the High Court in London. In Europe, American Supreme Court judgments are taken into account, but equally Supreme Court there takes into account what happens in Europe. And so the American right are very much concerned to stop liberalisation of human rights law in Europe, because that could be influential on their own Supreme Court. So we're faced, as you say, with a very well financed, very well resourced opposition, and it is extraordinarily difficult to know quite how to oppose it. When I was the president of the European Humanist Federation for 6 years, until just over a year ago. And as this pattern became apparent, we realised that we had got to bring together the organisations that had a common interest in opposing this development of the religious right in Europe. And we created around the European Parliament platform for secularism in politics, which is a backbench group in the European Parliament. We created from there something called an Alliance for a Secular Europe. It sounds sort of grand and powerful. It is in effect only an email group of organisations, but it is functioning now quite effectively to keep organisations in touch with developments and to concert lobbying and activity in our own defence. It brings in not just humanist and secularist organisations, but also women's rights organisations, gay organisations, population and Planned Parenthood type organisations, civil liberty organisations, all sorts of groups that we seem to have an interest in opposing the religious right in courts and in politics. And that sort of collaboration is also beginning in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And shall I carry on talking about this? Is this all right? I'm going rather off subject. There's an Italian MP who, thank goodness, has recently lost his seat in Italy, and so his days in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe are numbered. But over the last few years, he has been remarkably effective on behalf of Vatican and that sort of interest. He was a senior MP. He was the leader. I think technically still is the leader of the EPP group, the basic conservative group in the Parliamentary Assembly. And he was also in charge of the committee that scheduled business, which is an important function, obviously. He had one major victory, one minor victory, and he's recently suffered one defeat, luckily they came in that order. In 2010, there was a report from one of the Parliament's committees on the need to put some limits on the exercise of conscientious objection by doctors, nurses and so on, so as to protect women's rights to family planning, abortion, and people's rights generally to euthanasia. The focus was made on abortion. This was a report drawn up by a British MP called Christine Capital. In advance of it being discussed, there was the most vicious distortion in all the religious lobbying circles of what it actually was proposing. Luca Volonte, this MP, managed to schedule the report to be discussed late on a Thursday evening when most MPs had already left Strasbourg. He managed to get his own group to stick around, and they moved a series of amendments to it, many of which were adopted, which totally subverted the meaning of the resolution, but left it incoherent. Of course, there were some parts that weren't changed, so we adopted it. That was a major defeat for us. We had been aware of this happening, we'd done a little bit of lobbying, but we weren't organised. About a year later, there was another report came up, which at first sight appeared not to be controversial. It was about living wills. And so we weren't organised at all with it. And Luca Volonte managed to move at the last minute an amendment to the resolution, which said none of this, of course, affects or has any effect on abortion, which must remain illegal in all countries, the Council of Europe, in all circles and systems. And you must get that through as well. And so what was a very useful resolution on living wills now has that unwanted issue. Then, just a few weeks ago, he himself produced a resolution. He had got permission from a committee, and he actually went way beyond his remit and produced a report on all the grievances that Christians feel, not just outside Europe, but especially inside Europe, all the sort of the effects of equality laws and non-discrimination laws on them and that sort of thing. And this was a very serious, dangerous resolution. Now, by this time we had got it organised, and so a group of NGOs, one of them was ILGA, the International Lesbian Gay Association, one was the offshoot of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, one was ourselves, the International Humanist Federation, which I was representing in the Council of Europe. And the last, I've forgotten for the moment, was a women's organisation, I can't remember which one it was. We organised ourselves to jointly prepare amendments to his resolution and to lobby and to get particular MPs to move particular aspects about all our amendments. I was concerned to ensure that all his mentions of religion became mentions of religion or belief, including non-religious beliefs, humanism, and got British contact, British MP, like Conte, to move all those, but it was all done in concert, and we got the whole lot through, so that what was a potentially dangerous resolution actually become a very useful one. And although the religious right-wing press, the websites reported it as a victory for freedom of religion, you could see they actually got their tails between their legs and they were a bit fed up. But we've got, that sort of organisation takes a lot of effort. It takes continuous monitoring of what's going on, not just in the Parliamentary Assembly, the European Parliament and the National Parliament. It takes building up a dossier of who are our friends and keeping contact with them. It means maintaining our alliances and working collaboratively together. It means being able to act very swiftly, because all that work on that latest resolution had to happen within 10 days. It was only 10 days notice between the time that it was published and the time it went to the vote. And in that time we had to get together, we had to do the drafting, to organise the lobbying, to influence the party groupings and so on and so forth. And although I played some part in it, the major part was played by one of the other organisations that was much better established in Strasbourg. So it's a tough task, it's a tough ask. And what we still lack is any body of lawyers, of human rights lawyers, who are outside, and yes, exactly, and who are willing to put time and effort into fighting cases. And so when the Nazi case came up, and when other cases have come up, there are lots of religious and conservative groups wanting to be joined in as third parties to the case. And there are some on our side as well, but they tend to be relatively resourceless and relatively amateur. And you need those professional, really clever lawyers to come in. Because the discussion about the law on this is very complex. And I go to some of these academic conferences of academic lawyers and practicing lawyers arguing out what exactly these exceptions to freedom of religion belief article mean in practice, what should be, how should it be interpreted, and so on. And it is very complex indeed. It needs very careful attention. And the law is a creative art. It's not just logic and reason. It's creation of concepts and ways of looking at things. So it needs people who are experts in it, who speak the language and understand it, to argue out why it is, for example, the whole idea of reasonable accommodation, which came in as something as part of the law on disability discrimination. That, an employer should provide reasonable accommodation in his premises, in his practices, for people who are disabled so that they can work there. Why that is not a good concept to apply to employers adapting to employment of religious people with who are in demand for their rights. It's not immediately obvious why this is, and it needs some clever lawyers to do it, and unfortunately, some of the cleverest lawyers are up in clever way. Yeah, I've talked a lot too much about that.
Yeah, one last question before we all pass out. Is there, anyone have one last?
Is there any theist organisations or deist organisations that would be of alliance to us in many of the general movements? I mean, a lot of religious people are not dogmatic and are very fair-minded, and I think they've been done a disservice by these far rights, because their far rights are going to take away the rights of religions anyway. The average theist is going to suffer terribly under their mandates in the first place, because most of the people who are pushing these mandates are fanatical, they're authoritarian, and they often make caveats for the leadership of that group to be exemptions to the rules that they're setting up in the first place, so they can enjoy the luxuries while keeping everyone else in the dark.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, so there must be groups out there that are aware of that. I mean, they are aware that the damage has been done by their compatriots, supposedly in their name, while not actually serving their greater interest.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And there are some. They tend, unfortunately, to be rather poorly resourced, and also they tend to be rather closely focused on their own position within their church or whatever it is. But there are bodies like there's a movement called the European Network Church on the Move. I think it goes by different names in different countries, which is very liberal Catholics trying to throw off the yoke of Vatican. And they're very nice people. We work with them in the European Humanist Federation. We work alongside them quite a bit. But they don't bring a great deal of resource to the table. In Britain, there's a think tank called Ecclesia, which is very liberal, non-Catholic. But it is exclusive. I don't know my doctrine, not Catholic, it just happens to be. And they produce reports and engage in public discussion with policy. And they're
Sorry, what was that?
they're pretty good. The British Humanist Association works quite often with Ecclesia. I mean, when we're looking for religious allies, they're our first port of call, and they usually come on board arguments about religious schools and that sort of thing. They're it's horses for courses. In some cases, the Mormon Church and the Mormon University in Utah, what's it called? They are they're pretty good on human rights, and although we differ on a lot of things, there are some times when we can come together and work quite closely with them, and that's at an international level, obviously, rather than national. So you have to look for allies where you can find them, but it is important to get religious allies in this sort of thing. but the hard work generally has to be done by the secularists.
You'd be generally able to rely on a secular group more because they would have a wider aspect of similarities with your movements. You wouldn't be dealing with just a particular issue, then wouldn't be able to rely on other issues. I suppose the problem with, if you're dealing with some high-priced lawyer, is that they are often in partnership maybe with religious people, and if they come out in support of a non-religious cause, they themselves are at risk of discord in their own business.
I don't know. I mean, I've not come across that. No. I think there's the human rights lawyers that we want to get on board tend to be much more independent-minded. The main problem is that they have their own interests that they're pursuing in different areas of human rights law. But if we could, if we were going to succeed in getting this sort of group of lawyers together, then it really would have to include someone like, for example, Jeffrey Robertson. Did you read over here the book that he produced at the time that the previous Pope visited Britain in 2010? It was a Penguin special called The Case of the Pope.
No, I haven't.
And it is a wonderful read. I very strongly recommend it to you. This is a lawyer looking at the standing of the Vatican as an international, allegedly as a state.
Mm-hmm.
Its operations within international treaty organisations like the UN and so on. Its record on in connection with the child abuse scandals, in terms of abiding by diplomatic treaties about how states should behave to each other, sadly wanting, and so on and so forth. It's a great book, and it ends up with the feasibility just about arguable that the Pope could be taken to court.
Was that the aspect?
We have to call it there because I think some people are actually going to fall over.
Okay. All right.
If you want to ask questions, I suggest you do so afterwards.
Right.
Sorry, I'm just cutting it short because I'm too hot. So thank you all for coming. We won't be having a meeting in August. I'm going to take a month off so I can start my new job. And in September we'll be having a meeting to discuss what's going to happen to the Cork Humanists and where they're going to go and what the future will be. So you have 2 months to get your thinking caps on and see where you'd like to see us go. And I'd like to thank you all once again very much for coming. And hopefully I will see you, and of course thank David. And I will hopefully see you all in September. Thank you very much for coming today.